Hi, welcome. We're going to get started. I'll get myself organized. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I am the Director of Government Affairs here at the Public Policy Institute of California. And I want to thank you for joining us today. It feels a little nippy out there. It feels like we're into fall. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with offices both in San Francisco and Sacramento. Of course, I'm in the Sacramento office, so we think it's the better office, but we won't go there. For today's program, we're going to learn the findings of PPIC's latest statewide survey on Californians and their government. This survey was supported with funding from the James Irvine Foundation and the PPIC Donor Circle, and we'd like to thank them for their support for this work. We'd also like to acknowledge the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this event and the lunch today. At registration, you should have received a document that contains some key findings on this survey. The full survey, along with crosstabs and time trends for adults and likely voters, as well as the slides from today's presentation, are now available online at ppic.org. After the presentation, you should have plenty of time for question and answers. We're recording it, so please wait for the microphones so that we can hear your question. And a few things before we begin. Our next event, Broadening Access to Transfer Level Courses at the Community Colleges, will take place here this coming Tuesday, October 8th, featuring a presentation on a new PPIC report, as well as great panelists and experts. You may sign up now for this event. And there are a few other events that will be posted shortly. And later today, our survey team will send you a survey. It's what they do all the time. It's hard to be in meetings with them without them doing a survey. But please respond to that survey. We do look at the answers, and we do try to adjust things to make these more informative for you. And please silence your cell phones. On Tuesday, I live in East Sacramento. I was walking home, and some of the neighbors had already put out Halloween decorations. And I'm like, what? This is way too early. And it struck me that, maybe there's some other early things happening. And this survey is our first 2020 election survey. That feels too early, too. But if you know that in 5 months, California will have its primary because the legislature moved up the presidential primary. Part of the rationale is they were a little tired of the state just being a piggy bank, and so they felt that to be more relevant in the presidential primary, we should move it up. So 5 months today, we will have the primary. 4 months from today, we actually will be able to vote because of the ballots will be mailed to you. It's the same day those Iowans go to their caucus, so you know. It's very soon. So formally, October for me is a little scary. It seems too early for both of those things. Rachel, who's going to present for you today, will share some important observations on the Democratic primary horse race, as well as some information on a potential question or potential ballot measure in November. We had a first in this poll, and I wanted to point it out to you. This is the first poll where homelessness was the top issue, top concern of PPIC respondents in our history. And there's bipartisan consensus on this. Democrats, Republicans, and independents all had it as their first-tier concern. There's some variation among regions, so this is a good time to remind you that our crosstabs are online and provide really important nuances to the questions. Speaking of first, we have our first-time presenter here at PPIC. Rachel Lawler, who just got married, joined us earlier this year and has quickly become a valuable member of our research team. Welcome, Rachel, but be nice to her, folks. It's her first time. We want her to come back. Now I'd like to bring Rachel up here, who is a PPIC Research Associate and Survey Project Manager. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So thank you all for coming out today and for your interest in this survey and in PPIC's work. As Deborah mentioned, my name is Rachel Lawler, and I am a research associate on PPIC's statewide surveys team. And before we get into the findings of our survey today, I just wanted to acknowledge the other co-authors on this presentation and this report. the PPIC President, CEO, and Survey Director, Mark Baldessari, our Associate Survey Director, Dean Bonner, and my fellow research associate, Alyssa Dykman. So before we begin, I just wanted to quickly preview what we're going to be covering today. I'll first go through some PPIC statewide survey general information for those of you that maybe don't know that much about our surveys or this is your first time at this event. It's going to include our mission and our methodology for this report. And after that, we'll look at our two sections for the report, the first being state and national issues, and the second will be on approval ratings and the 2020 election. And this will be followed by some concluding remarks from myself, and as Deborah mentioned, we'll definitely leave some time at the end for any questions. So PPIC's statewide survey mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions of all Californians. We hope that this will inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. And since 1998, PPIC has conducted over 180 general, regional, and issue-specific surveys through which we have spoken with over 360,000 Californians. Subsequently, we have a large database of questions that we've used on previous surveys, and this allows us to track and compare how opinions change over time. So this particular survey focuses on Californians and their government, and as Deborah mentioned, I want to thank our funders for their generous and continued support for this particular survey series. And for this survey, our fieldwork period was from September 16th through the 25th. And as you may be aware, during this period, there began to be news reports of a possible whistleblower in the Trump administration. And this led up to Speaker Pelosi's announcement of a formal impeachment inquiry of the president on September 24th. So by this time, we had conducted the bulk of our field work in data collection for this survey, but just something to keep in mind while we review the results. It's also important to remember that the state legislature was just wrapping up its first year of its 2019-2020 session. Our responses for the survey were collected via live telephone interviews, with 70% being done on cell phones and 30% being done on landlines. The interviews were conducted in Spanish and English, depending upon the respondents' preferences. And for this survey, we spoke to just over 1,700 Californian adults, including just over 1,000 that we identified as likely voters. The margin of error for the all-adult sample is 3.2%, and for the likely voter sample, it's 4.2%. And as myself and Deborah mentioned, we'll be looking at a number of state and national issues and policy preferences, as well as some topics that will help us kind of set the stage for the upcoming election. So let's start off by looking at what Californians name as the most important issue facing the state today. And often what we found when we asked this question is that responses can reflect what's in the headlines, what's in the news. If people are hearing about it, they'll often mention it in our survey. And so, as Deborah mentioned, 15% say homelessness is the biggest issue, and another 15% say jobs and the economy are the most important issue. And this is a 5 percentage point increase in those that are saying jobs and the economy, and a 9 percentage point increase in those mentioning homelessness. And as Deborah mentioned, the first time it's ever been the #1 issue. And that those percentage point increases are from the last time we asked this question, which was in January of this year. Housing costs and availability, immigration and illegal immigration, and environmental issues round out the top 5 issues that were mentioned, followed by the government in general and the state budget. It's also worth mentioning that the issues mentioned on this slide are those that receive mentions of 5% or greater. As we look at this data across regions, what we find interestingly is that 21% of adults in Los Angeles name homelessness as the most important issue, while 22% in the San Francisco Bay Area say housing costs and availability. And that's really interesting because we know that those two issues are quite intertwined with one another. And the other three major regions of the state, the economy and jobs emerges as the most important issue. And homelessness is named as the top issue among all racial and ethnic groups, with the exception of Latinos, who say jobs and the economy is most important. We also asked respondents about their general outlook for the state, that is, if the state is going in the right direction, the wrong direction, and whether they think the state will experience good or bad financial times over the next year. And today we find 46% of adults and 41% of likely voters saying that things are headed in the right direction. And prior to this survey, those saying that the state was going in the right direction has been at 50% or higher for the last several years. And this is actually the lowest share of adults that we've seen since a few years ago, saying that the state is going in the right direction, actually since May 2015. That's particularly important and interesting given the potential implications that it could have for the upcoming primary and general elections. So today, Democrats are far more likely than Republicans and independents to think things are going in the right direction, and less than half across regions think the state is going in the right direction, with the exception of Los Angeles residents, where a very slim majority say that the state is going in the right direction. And when we asked about the state's financial future over the next 12 months, 4 in 10 adults and likely voters think the state will experience good times financially, while about 50% say that we'll have bad times. And these expectations were similar this past May when we last asked this question. And today, expectations are similar across parties and regions, with around 4 in 10 saying that we will have good times. Latinos are the most likely among racial and ethnic groups to expect good times, and men are much more likely than women to say this. So I'm sure a lot of you either felt or read about the 7.1 magnitude earthquake that California experienced earlier this summer, and this was actually the state's strongest quake in more than 20 years. Also in recent memory was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in the state's history that we had last year, and that we are in the middle of wildfire season right now. So with that in mind, we asked Californians how prepared they are for major disasters such as earthquakes, wildfires, or floods. And we found that about 6 in 10 adults report having a disaster preparedness kit for their household that includes things like water, food, and other essential emergency supplies. And 4 in 10 Californians say that they do not have a kit. And this represents a 9 percentage point increase in adults who say they have a kit since we last asked this question in 2014. And the shares of adults who have a kit increases as income rises, and homeowners are more likely than renters to say that they have a kit. Half or more among racial ethnic groups say they have a kit, and at least half across regions say the same. It's worth mentioning that Los Angeles residents are the most likely across regions to say that they have a disaster preparedness kit. We also asked respondents whether or not they have a definite disaster plan in place in case of something like an earthquake, a fire, or a flood. And half of Californians say that they do have a plan, while 44% say that they do not. And this represents a 6 percentage point increase in those that say they have a plan versus 2014 when we last asked this. As we saw with disaster preparedness kits, homeowners are more likely than renters to have a plan, and regionally more than 4 in 10 across the regions have a plan. And again, Los Angeles residents are the most likely to say that they have a plan. Slightly more than half of Californians over age 35 have a plan in place versus 4 in 10 of those ages 18 to 34. And majorities of African Americans and whites say they have a plan in place, while fewer than half of Asian Americans and Latinos say this. And in terms of having both a disaster plan and a disaster kit, 41% of Californians say they have both, while 28% say that they do not have either. We also asked respondents how worried they are about their household experiencing personal injury, property damage, or major disruption of their routine if there were to be a major disaster. And about 6 in 10 adults say they are very or somewhat worried about this, and these findings were similar to when we last asked this question in 2014. Majorities across demographic groups, with the exception of those with household incomes over $80,000, say they are at least somewhat worried. And with 42% saying they are very worried, Latinos are the most likely among all demographic groups to be worried about personal injury or property damage or disruption of their routine. Regionally, Los Angeles area residents are the most likely to be very somewhat worried. And if you remember back to our 2 previous questions, they are also the most likely to have a disaster kit and a disaster plan. So while they're the most worried, they also appear to be the most prepared. Another topic that we covered on our September survey is the perception of immigrants in California. And we saw an overwhelming majority of Californians continue to see immigrants as a benefit because of their hard work and job skills, while about 1 in 5 say immigrants are a burden because they use public services. In our surveys, if we look back all the way to January 2013, at least 6 in 10 Californians have said that immigrants are a benefit. And today there is a large partisan divide between those who say that immigrants are a benefit versus those that say they are a burden. And regionally, adults in Los Angeles, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Orange, San Diego are slightly more likely to say immigrants are a benefit than those in the Central Valley and Inland Empire. Across the racial and ethnic groups, Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans are more likely than whites to think that immigrants are a benefit to the state, as are those under the age of 54 compared to those 55 and older. And when it comes to concern about increased federal immigration efforts, half of adults and 4 in 10 likely voters say that they worry a lot or some about someone that they know being deported. And findings were similar when we last asked this question a year ago. Notably, 52% of Latinos and 47% of residents who were not born in this country say that they worry a lot about someone that they know being deported. Today, Democrats are much more likely to say that they worry a lot, that's a lot or some, that someone they know will get deported compared to independents and Republicans. And about 1 in 3 Californians under the age of 55 say they worry a lot compared to, 1 in 3 Californians under the age of 55 say they worry a lot compared to 1 in 5 Californians over the age of 55. Residents in the Inland Empire are the most likely to say they worry a lot, and worry decreases as education and income levels rise. It's now been 9 years since the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, and 55% of Californians and 54% of likely voters have a favorable opinion of the law. These findings were similar both to our March survey and a national survey conducted by the Kaiser Family Foundation this September, in which 53% of adults nationwide had a favorable opinion and 41% had an unfavorable opinion. Democrats and Republicans continue to have opposing views of the ACA, while independents are divided. Majorities across regions and demographic groups have favorable opinions of the law, with the exception of whites, who are divided. And while a majority of adults view the ACA favorably, 7 in 10 Californians say they are very or somewhat worried about being able to afford the costs of their health care over the next few years. 3 in 4 Democrats say they are very or somewhat worried, compared to half of Republicans and 2 in 3 independents. And more than 6 in 10 are worried across regions. Across racial and ethnic groups, at least 6 in 10 are very or somewhat worried, with 53% of Latinos saying that they are very worried. And the share saying that they are very or somewhat worried declines with increasing age, education, and income levels. Women are more likely than men to say that they are worried, and renters are more likely than homeowners to be worried. And as we saw in a recent ABC News Washington Post poll, adults nationwide expressed similar levels overall of being very or somewhat worried. But at 38%, Californians are slightly less likely to say they're very worried than adults nationwide at 45%. And as I'm sure all of you know, we've unfortunately had a number of mass shootings across the nation over the past few months, including one here in California at the Gilroy Garlic Festival. And in the wake of these shootings, we asked Californians whether they would like the laws that cover the sale of guns to be made more strict, less strict, or kept as they are now. And we found that about 2/3 of Californians and likely voters think these laws should be stricter, while 2 in 10 think they should be kept as they are now, and 1 in 10 think they should be made less strict. Opinions were similar when we last asked this question in October of last year, and a vast majority of Democrats favor stricter laws, as do more than half of independents, while 44% of Republicans want the laws kept as they are now. Across regions, 3 in 4 in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles favor stricter laws compared to fewer elsewhere, and majorities across racial and ethnic groups favor stricter laws. Women are more likely than men to favor stricter laws, and younger adults are as likely as older adults to support stricter laws. And the share that favors stricter gun laws declines as income rises. When we asked respondents about concern about the threat of a mass shooting in their area, 2 in 3 adults and likely voters say they are very or somewhat concerned, and the share of adults who are now saying that they are very concerned has risen 10 percentage points from January 2016 when we last asked this question. Democrats are more than twice as likely as Republicans to say they are very or somewhat concerned, and majorities across regions are at least somewhat concerned about the threat of a mass shooting. Concern about a mass shooting declines as education and income levels increase. And among racial and ethnic groups, Latinos and African Americans are the most likely to be worried, with 55% of Latinos saying that they are very concerned. Younger adults are also equally likely as older adults to worry about a mass shooting. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the Supreme Court is set to begin a new term next week on October 7th, and the justices may agree to hear one or more cases with the potential to significantly affect abortion rights that established under the 1973 decision Roe versus Wade. When we asked Californians whether or not they want Roe versus Wade overturned, 66% of adults and 73% of likely voters said they do not want to see the decision overturned. And these findings are similar to the findings from last September. A strong majority of Democrats and independents do not want the decision overturned, as do a very slim majority of Republicans. Regionally, about 6 in 10 in the Central Valley, Los Angeles, and the Inland Empire do not want the decision overturned, with slightly more, 3 in 4 in Orange, San Diego, and the San Francisco Bay Area saying the same. Among racial and ethnic groups, whites and African Americans are more likely to not want the Roe decision overturned compared to fewer Asian Americans and Latinos. And interestingly, women and men share similar views, with 69% of women and 63% of men not wanting the decision to be overturned. The share saying they do not want Roe overturned increases as education and income levels rise. And according to a recent nationwide Gallup poll, 60% of adults nationwide said they do not want the decision overturned. So at 66%, Californians are slightly more likely than the nation as a whole to say that they do not want this decision overturned. We also asked respondents whether they think some states are making it too difficult or too easy for people to get an abortion. And a majority of adults and likely voters think some states are making it too difficult, while about 1/3 think some states are making it too easy. An overwhelming majority of Democrats say some states are making it too difficult, compared to about 6 in 10 independents and 1/4 of Republicans. Half or more across regions say too difficult, with the exception of the Central Valley, where residents are divided. Similarly, majorities across racial and ethnic groups say some states are making it too difficult, with the exception of Latinos, who are also divided. Again, men and women have similar views that some states are making it too difficult, and younger adults, those with at least some college education, and those with higher incomes are more likely to think this as well. So we're going to move on to our second section of the presentation, which looks at approval ratings and the 2020 election. So starting with approval ratings for our state elected officials, at 44% among all adults and 43% among likely voters, Governor Newsom's approval rating has been very, very stable since he took office in January. And since then, we've seen a decrease in those who say they do not have enough or have not heard enough information to make a decision or don't have an opinion. That's down from 33% in January to 24% today. However, with that decrease, we've also seen an increase in those who express disapproval, up from 23% in January to 32% today. Democrats are more likely to approve of the governor's job performance than are independents and Republicans, and at least 4 in 10 across regions approve, as do about half of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos, compared to about 4 in 10 whites. And moving on to the state legislature at the end of its first year of the 2019-2020 session, 43% of adults and 38% of likely voters approve of the way the legislature is handling its job, which is similar to the ratings we saw both in January of this year and September of last year. Today, more than half of Democrats approve, compared to 1 in 3 independents and about 1 in 10 Republicans. At least 4 in 10 across regions approve, while Asian Americans and Latinos are more likely to approve of the job the legislature is doing than are African Americans and whites. And moving on to approval ratings for our federal elected officials, President Trump's approval rating continues to be relatively steady at 30% among all adults and 35% among likely voters. And these ratings are similar to the approval ratings we saw in January and last September. The president's approval ratings are highly partisan driven, with the overwhelming majority of Republicans approving and fewer than 1 in 10 Democrats approving. Outside of Republicans, fewer than half across regions and demographic groups approve of the president's job performance, and Californians tend to be more critical of President Trump than the nation as a whole, where, according to a recent Gallup poll, 43% of adults nationwide say they approve of the president. And when we look at ratings for Congress, 1 in 3 adults and 1 in 4 likely voters approve of Congress's job performance. And we find slightly more partisan agreement here than with President Trump, as around 3 in 10 or fewer across parties actually approve of the job that Congress is doing. Fewer than half across regions and demographic groups approve. And when we look at national opinions, we find that at 33%, Californians are more optimistic about the job that Congress is doing compared to adults nationwide, where only 18% say that they approve of Congress. And turning to approval ratings for California's 2 senators and House representatives, today Senators Dianne Feinstein and Kamala Harris both have very similar approval ratings overall and among key demographic groups. Both senators have approval ratings of 40% among all adults and 44% and 43% respectively among likely voters. Approval was similar among all adults last September, but both senators have seen a drop in approval among likely voters. We saw a 9 percentage point drop in approval for Senator Feinstein and a 12 percentage point drop in approval for Senator Harris. About 2 in 3 Democrats approve of Senator Feinstein and Senator Harris, as do about 1/3 of independents. 19% of Republicans approve of the job that Senator Feinstein is doing, while slightly fewer, 13%, approve of Senator Harris's job. Around half in the San Francisco Bay Area approve of Senator Feinstein and Senator Harris, compared to fewer than 4 in 10 in other regions. And among racial and ethnic groups, African Americans are the most likely to approve of both of the senators' job performances. About half of women approve of Senator Feinstein, while 43% of women approve of Senator Harris. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the saying that people often hate Congress, but they love their own representative. And while I'm not sure that our survey results prove that people love their representative, we definitely see that saying playing out here to an extent. As we saw on the last slide, only 33% of Californians approve of the job Congress is doing, while about half of adults and likely voters say that they approve of the job being done by their own representative in the House of Representatives. Findings were similar this time last year, and Democrats are about twice as likely as Republicans and independents to say that they approve. About half in the Inland Empire, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area say they approve, compared to fewer in the Central Valley and the Orange and San Diego regions. And also about half or more across racial and ethnic groups say they approve. And with the 2020 election just around the corner, concerns about the electoral process in the US inevitably come up. So we wanted to ask Californians about how much confidence they have in the system in which votes are cast and counted in California elections. And we found that fewer than 4 in 10 adults have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in our electoral process, while about 6 in 10, they have some or very little confidence. And these figures are similar to what we saw 2 years ago in September when we last asked this question. However, if we go all the way back to October of 2004, which is right before a presidential election, and our first time asking this question, we find confidence in our electoral system has gone down. In October of 2004, 51% of adults said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in our election process versus only 36% of adults today. And we see a similar drop among likely voters. Today, Democrats are more likely to say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence than are independents and Republicans. And African Americans, Latinos, and whites are more likely to say that they have a great deal of confidence in the electoral system than Asian Americans. Older Californians are also more likely to say they have a great deal of confidence than are younger Californians. And critics of the electoral process generally fall into 2 main camps, those that say voter suppression is a major threat to the democratic process, and those that say voter fraud is a bigger problem. So we asked Californians how concerned they are about it being too hard for people who are eligible to vote, and conversely, how concerned they are about it being too easy for ineligible people to vote. And we found at 54%, a slight majority of Californians are very or somewhat concerned that it's too easy for ineligible people to vote, compared to 45% who are concerned that it is too hard for eligible people to vote. And Democrats are much more likely than Republicans to be concerned that it is too hard for eligible people to vote. And conversely, Republicans are far more likely than Democrats and Democrats and independents to be concerned that it is too easy for ineligible people to vote. Among racial and ethnic groups, concern that it is too hard for eligible people to vote is higher among African Americans and Latinos than among Asian Americans and whites, and 42% of African Americans say that they are very concerned. Concern that it is too easy for ineligible people to vote also rises with increasing age. And we know there are likely going to be a number of key state ballot measures on both the March 2020 and November 2020 ballot. So we wanted to ask Californians about how they might vote on these measures, potential measures at this fairly early stage. And the first measure we're going to look at that will likely be on the March ballot is the Public Preschool K12 and College Health and Safety Bond Act of 2020, although this title was not included in what was read to our respondents. And we found that 2 in 3 adults say they would vote yes on this $15 billion school modernization and construction measure, but support drops among likely voters, of whom 54% say they would vote yes at this stage. Democrats and independents are far more likely than Republicans to support the bond measure, and majorities across regions say that they would vote yes, but support is lowest in Orange and San Diego, with 59% saying they would vote yes. About 7 in 10 or more Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans say they would vote yes, compared to about half of whites, and support for the measure declines as age, education levels, and income increase. We also asked about another ballot measure that will likely be on the November ballot. This one is the Prop 13 split roll property tax. 57% of adults and 47% of likely voters said that they would vote yes. And this is a slight decrease in support among likely voters from our April survey, in which 54% of likely voters had said that they would vote yes. Again, we see that partisans are sharply divided, and residents in Orange, San Diego are the least likely to support the measure. Support is higher among Latinos and African Americans than among Asian Americans and whites, and support declines as age, education levels, and income increases. So moving on now to the subject that is on everyone's mind, the 2020 presidential election. So before we get into where the candidates stand in the Democratic primary race, we'll set the scene a little bit by taking a look at a question that we asked regarding debate performance. And we asked Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents how important the candidates' performances are in public debates in terms of deciding who to vote for in the presidential primary. And with 5 debates having already taken place, over 8 in 10 say candidate performances are very or somewhat important when deciding how to cast their vote. 61% of Latinos say debate performances are very important, compared to 37% of whites and 30% of members of other racial ethnic groups. Also, younger voters are slightly more likely than older voters to say that debate performance is very important. And if the Democratic primary for president were being held today, 2 in 3 likely Democratic voters would choose either Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, or Bernie Sanders, who are all in a statistical dead heat. It's worth mentioning that for this particular survey, for this question, we included the 11 Democratic presidential candidates who had qualified for an upcoming Democratic National Committee debate that was before the beginning of our fieldwork period. And also these 11 names were rotated and read aloud to our respondents, but respondents could also name someone that wasn't included on this list. Today, Joe Biden is preferred by 3 in 10 older voters, that's age 45 and older, and while nearly 4 in 10 voters under the age of 45 support Bernie Sanders. Sanders also has the support of 39% of Latinos, while Elizabeth Warren has support from 34% of whites. And in a separate but related question, we asked those who chose a candidate in this question if they would consider supporting another candidate, or if they were definitely supporting their chosen candidate as long as he or she was in the race. And we found that 53%, so just a very slight majority, say they would consider supporting another candidate, while 44% say they are definitely supporting their candidate as long as they are in the race. Among those who said that they would vote for Warren, 65% say that they would consider supporting another candidate, while 63% of Sanders supporters and 56% of Biden supporters say that they will definitely be supporting their candidate as long as he is in the race. So we've covered a lot of topics and findings today, but in conclusion, we found that homelessness has tied with jobs and the economy as the top issue facing the state, that many lower income Californians are worried about their healthcare costs, natural disasters, and mass shootings in their area, that strong majorities oppose overturning the Roe versus Wade decision, and many express concerns about some states making it too difficult to get an abortion. We saw that California's 2 senators and House representatives have higher approval ratings than Congress overall, while the president's approval rating remains stable. The state's elected leaders and economic outlook are getting mixed reviews, and a slim majority of likely voters support a $15 billion construction bond. Warren, Biden, and Sanders lead in the Democratic presidential primary, but many Democratic-leaning voters are open to switching allegiances at this stage. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions, and please just remember for Hannah to bring you the mic since we are recording this. So, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really excellent and
Thank
super
you.
interesting.
Great.
Well done.
Thanks.
At the top, you made a comment on the statistic about the moving in the right direction. It was 46%, so
Yeah.
moving in the right direction. And then you said it's the first time in the history of PPIC surveys that it's gone less
Since
than 50?
May 2015.
Since May 2015. Could you just repeat that interesting factoid? Thank you.
Yes, so let me make sure I get it exactly as I had said it before, but it is, I believe it's more or less, expectations, let me see. So those saying that the state was going in the right direction has been at 50% or above for the last several years, and this is the lowest share of adults saying that the state is going in the right direction since May of 2015. Yeah. Just wanted to make sure I gave it to you exactly as I said it. Is there any other questions?
Hi, these questions are related to definitions. Do you make any differentiation when you use the word immigration between that which is undocumented immigration and those that are legally here documented?
Are you referring to the benefit bird or just?
Yes.
I can give you the exact question wording here. We say, we don't make a differentiation. We just say immigrants today are a benefit to California because of their hard work and job skills, or immigrants today are a burden to California because they use public services. In our most important issue question, we do have separate codes for people that might just say immigration versus those that say illegal immigration, but typically we combine those so we have an overall, I think on that slide it says immigration/illegal immigration.
Okay, then I would also assume then the word homeless would also be combined between those that, for instance, are homeless because of drug issues versus those that are homeless strictly because of certain economic factors.
Yeah, I believe any mention of homelessness goes into that category regardless of whether they say because of a specific reason. We do have separate codes for, say, if someone says crime or drugs, but that's kind of a separate issue. If you know what I mean, if someone says homelessness, they go into that bucket.
All right, thank you. Is that information noted somewhere so it can be looked at?
Dean, my co-author here, I'm trying to think if we have that noted. We do have a full list, if it's the most important issue question in the report, we have a full list of all of the issues that were mentioned, but I don't know that we specifically mentioned that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question about the school facilities bond. Is an initial polling result of 54%, is that a bad sign, you would say, for that? Or
Well, it's still really early. Well, maybe not, as Deborah was mentioning. But it was 54% among likely voters. You know, I think it's still early. It was only, I don't think the governor has signed it as of today. So, I mean, it's nearly within the margin of error. So I'd say, you know, you'd probably want to see it to be a bit higher, but there's still some time in there. And
Yeah, I would just add that you're exactly right, that it is somewhat early, but, you know, starting off at 54% isn't exactly the best place you want to be. However, this was not the full title and language that we'll be asking later in the year. And so once you have that information, it'll, you know, perhaps give more information about where the funds will be directed, how high of a share will go to K12 versus community college versus the UCs. And so all of those things will kind of play a factor in how a person decides on that individual ballot measure. But, you know, in general, if this was the full ballot measure in title, and it was 54% among likely voters, you know, that isn't necessarily great when there hasn't been a no campaign as of yet. But it's still very early on, so.
Just one quick question on the split roll. I know you said it dropped, I think, 7 points since
among likely voters since April.
April. I think you've asked it a couple times the last couple of years. Is it the lowest it's been in the last couple of years? or is
I'd
it-
have to go back and check
Okay.
that.
I
That
forgot
was
to
just
check
our
this
most
one.
recent,
Okay.
last time we asked it, so that's what we compared to. But I I think we have the time trends online, so you
Oh,
can
yeah.
go on
I
and
just
see.
had a
Yeah.
chance this morning to take
Yeah,
a
yeah,
look.
sure.
Hi, I have a few questions.
Okay.
For the top issues that were identified, are those provided or are they free form? People can tell you what the issues
No,
are?
we do not read a list, so it's whatever the respondent says.
And then how do you choose the survey pool? Is it the same? Do you contact the same people?
No, so we use a method called random digit dial. So it's basically just random, and we don't track people. It's all anonymous. So no, it's not the same people every survey.
Okay, and then for the presidential candidate question, who was the someone else? Do they just say they would vote for someone else that's not an option?
We had, so I believe that 13% includes the other candidates who received, I believe, 5% or less mentions. So they might have been on the lists. Off the top of my head, I think Andrew Yang, and this is like, you can see the full list in the report. I think Andrew Yang got 3%, so he would go into that someone else bucket. It also included people like Tulsi Gabbard, who did not qualify for that debate, so her name was not read on the list, but there were people that mentioned her, so she would go into that list. Mhm. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I was hoping you could speak a little bit to the response rates and the representativeness of the sample in terms of race and ethnicity and age.
Sure. So Dean, I think maybe want to take this one.
So regarding the representativeness, our survey is, we make an effort to make sure we're talking to everyone in the state, but we also do weighting by age, sex, and region, as well as by party. And so at the end of the day, the representativeness of it ends up being very close to the kind of characteristics of the actual state. Regarding the response rates, that's something that is definitely a challenge for us, especially with some of the subgroups. But we make extra efforts to call certain subgroups, whether it's Asian Americans or African Americans and certain population areas, to make sure we're giving them extra chances to be included, because we know those are areas or groups of people where response rates tend to be a little lower. But overall, with telephone surveying, response rates have really fallen over the years, as less and less people either have a landline phone at home or actually want to answer a cell phone call from us. So if you get a weird call, perhaps answer it. It could be your friendly surveyor just asking your opinion and your input of how better to govern this great state. So.
Yeah. And we do, we do make, as he mentioned, an effort for like African American groups, Asian Americans, to have a minimum sample size that we feel comfortable talking about that group as a subgroup. So we do that with every survey. Yeah. And,
How do you define someone as a likely voter versus a not likely voter?
So we have a model that we use for all of our surveys, and it's, Dean, remind me, it's the news question and.
Yeah, so first of all, they have to be a registered voter, of course. And then from there are a number of different kind of things that are included in the model. Attention to news, a little bit about kind of college education, how long they've lived at a certain address, which of course is becoming less problematic with the DMV registration. And so, but it's something that we continuously kind of look at. And as we get closer to the election, we'll also include whether or not people say they're going to vote, and of course, how much attention they're actually paying to news about candidates. And so it's a something that we're think works fairly well, and we're very transparent about it. We actually have a kind of a descriptive of it on in our each survey report, and then on our online methodology, it actually goes much deeper into kind of how it actually kind of like, it's this basically the syntax of how you become a likely voter or not, but in kind of verbal form. So, yeah.
Hey, thank you. I like the question about confidence in the voting and elections, but it seems like, especially now, as you mentioned, with the kind of recent threat and foreign interference, that might be the creation, there might need to be a creation of another question maybe to capture if folks are feeling that other threats besides whether it's too easy or too hard to actually vote and register. So I was just wondering if you thought about that, if you could see if those fitted in there. And then I was also wondering if you had any questions about opinions towards the media or maybe about where people get their news from. Is it social media or otherwise?
Yeah, so we have actually asked a question about kind of interference specifically related to Russia, and that was probably I think in May and then in the past as well. And regarding news sources, we have at different points in the past asked about that. We actually have a Just the Facts that's probably still online, although it's maybe a little outdated at this point, about where people got their news from. And, obviously it's a changing environment that even something taken 2 years ago is probably outdated because of the amount of news that people get from Twitter or Facebook or elsewhere. And so it is something that we, it's always on our mind, and hopefully at least once this election cycle, we'll ask some questions about that, because it is a very important topic. Yeah.
All right.
I would just like to say thank you, Rachel, for doing a great job.
Thanks. Thank you all for coming. I'll just leave that.